In today's explainer, we're going to untangle a really fascinating paradox about the mind, art, and what it actually takes to create a masterpiece that truly stands the test of time. Let's dive right in. Have you ever heard the saying that too much thinking ruins creativity? We've all seen the Hollywood movie version of the tortured artist, right? You know, the creative genius who relies entirely on these spontaneous, uncontrollable bursts of raw emotion. It's a hugely popular trope, but it begs a really important question. Does intellectual training actually destroy artistic sensibility? I mean, does overthinking literally kill the creative spark? Well, according to the source material we're examining today, which draws heavily on the insights of Philip Gilbert Hamerton, a celebrated intellectual and former art magazine editor, the answer is a resounding no. Intellect doesn't kill art, it elevates it. Hamerton argues that a true aesthetic life demands rigorous intellectual effort, not just raw, unbridled emotion.
Let's unpack that, starting with Section 1, the myth of artistic genius.
There's this incredibly widespread misconception that pure, unfiltered inspiration is the absolute only fuel a creator needs. But a trap that highly sensitive people so often fall into is that when they reject intellectual discipline, when they rely entirely on fleeting feelings and just wait for that magical lightning bolt of inspiration to strike, they actually put themselves in a really vulnerable position. They become passive passengers to their own wildly unpredictable emotions.
This leads us right into Section 2, Dangers of Pure Emotion.
So, what actually happens when left-brain intellect, conscious structure, and organizational thought are just completely abandoned in the pursuit of art? Well, history shows us it's rarely a sustainable path. Our source text provides a very logical step-by-step breakdown of this descent. Step 1 is a disrupted life rhythm. Relying only on sporadic inspiration means working erratically, sleeping terribly, and losing all structure. And that leads directly to Step 2, highly erratic behavior. Eventually, without the grounding force of logic and discipline, this all culminates in Step 3, which is moral and character decay. The artist entirely loses their center.
This tragic trajectory leads to what the text calls the ruined type of artist. Now, these erratic creators might portray base, chaotic human desires in a way that gets them massive, temporary commercial success, but they ultimately fail to guide humanity toward anything higher. In fact, if they're just creating from a place of pure sensory madness, they often leave a negative long-term influence on society. They might look like brilliant romantic figures in the short term, but their legacy, it's ultimately destructive.
But there is a fix, which brings us to Section 3, Intellect Elevates True Beauty.
The definitive antidote to this ruin lies in left-brain organization. Our sources highlight that continuous intellectual effort acts as a crucial framework. Think of it like scaffolding. It supports, organizes, and refines that raw, chaotic, artistic inspiration. Instead of destroying the sensitive spirit, intellectual discipline actually tempers and strengthens it. It allows the artist to reach for universal, heavenly beauty, rather than just sinking into the chaos of their own mind.
And this brings us to a really necessary moral checkpoint for any great creator. The text emphasizes that you absolutely must constantly question yourself. Is this right as a human being? Great art requires a high level of conscience. It requires you to consciously direct your work so it doesn't descend into madness or drag your audience down with it. You have to intellectually ask yourself if you're providing the right guidance through what you create.
Let's look at a concrete example. In Section 4, Picasso versus Phidias.
To really hammer this concept home, let's look at a powerful historical contrast presented in the text, starting with Pablo Picasso. Now, while he was undoubtedly a genius who had incredible traditional skills in his youth, the text uses Picasso as a prime example of a much more eccentric, purely sensory approach later in life. Some of his later, highly distorted works border on what the source describes as a sensory madness, leaving average observers completely confused, unable to discern if it's the work of a groundbreaking genius or someone who has simply lost their grip on reality. When we compare these two paths side by side, the contrast is stark. On the left, we have the sensory or eccentric approach, driven heavily by erratic emotions and often leading to a chaotic, unbalanced life. On the right, we have the intellectual, universal approach. This path is highly disciplined, morally grounded, and driven by high aspirations to present timeless, universal values to humanity. It's a path that requires immense mental fortitude.
So, let's move to the other side of that equation and see how this builds into something truly magnificent. We're taking a trip back to ancient Greece to meet Phidias, the master sculptor behind the incredible Parthenon. Phidias is presented in our sources as the absolute ultimate example of a highly disciplined, intellectually and morally driven artist. Which brings us to the climax of today's explainer in Section 5, True Art the Gods See.
There is a legendary story about Phidias that perfectly captures everything we've been talking about. When he was commissioned to create the magnificent statues for the Parthenon, they were designed to be placed incredibly high up on the temple walls. Because of this, no human eye would ever be able to see the backs of these figures once they were installed. Yet Phidias spent painstaking time, immense effort, and incredible skill carving the unseen backs of these statues just as beautifully and perfectly as the fronts. When the Athenian treasurer saw the bill, he was literally furious, refusing to pay for what he thought was completely useless, invisible work.
And here is Phidias's legendary, profound response to that treasurer: the gods are watching. He wasn't sculpting for the applause of the crowd, for fame, or for a quick commercial payout. He was guided by this unwavering internal discipline, a moral and intellectual commitment to absolute perfection, regardless of whether a human audience would ever actually validate his effort. So, the crucial takeaway here, the absolute core message of Hamerton's philosophy, is that true beauty, the kind that lasts for millennia and actually elevates the human spirit, is entirely supported by unseen effort. The hidden intellectual frameworks, the rigorous moral checkpoints, the quiet, disciplined hours of study and refinement, these are the invisible foundations that make a masterpiece truly eternal. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought. In a world that so often rewards quick, dramatic emotional outbursts and highly visible, immediate success, true greatness demands a remarkably different path. It requires the intellect to temper and guide the emotion. So I want to ask you, even where no one is looking, what unseen efforts are you carving today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this insight helps you build a beautifully disciplined intellectual foundation for whatever you choose to create next.